My sisters and brothers, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
This is a proclamation of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
When Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, that what had been said through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way to the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. On those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death, light has arisen. From that time on, Jesus began to preach and say, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." As he was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. Casting a net into the sea, they were fishermen. He said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you fishers of people." At once they left their nets to follow him. He walked along from there and saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. He called to them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. He went around all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and illness among the people. My sisters and brothers, this is the good news of our salvation.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
It isn't always easy to say goodbye, is it? At times it is easier depending on the situation. For example, someone being deployed to war must find it devastatingly difficult to say goodbye to their spouse, their children, their siblings, and parents. I'm sure that they begin by counting the minutes, the hours, and the days until their return. I remember the day when I began my postulancy with the friars, going to Buffalo. I was at Newark Airport getting ready to board a flight to Buffalo, 30-minute flight, and my mother and some friends were there. As soon as they announced the flight, the boarding call, I quickly turned around after hugging my mother and my friends and bolted for the gate. I didn't even want to see my mother's tears streaming down her cheeks, not to mention my own. I cry at a good movie. Don't even let me watch Madam X. It felt kind of lonely to say goodbye to them. After all, I was starting a new chapter in my life. I read of a man who had such a difficult time saying goodbye that he never did it. He would tell people that he was leaving on one particular day, but actually left the day before, so that when his friends and family came around to say their goodbyes, he had already left. This is unfair. We need to say goodbye. We need closure. When Jesus called Peter and Andrew, James and John to follow him, they left everything to follow him. But Matthew doesn't go into much detail in telling that story. He just says that Peter and Andrew immediately left their nets and followed him. He says that James and John immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. That is so cut and dry. It fails to tell the whole story. It fails to convey any emotion such as pain or joy. Peter and Andrew were brothers. James and John were brothers. They had always lived in their little village by the Sea of Galilee. They had learned the fishing trade by going out in small boats with their fathers, and they had known their friends all their lives. In those days, people didn't move around. They lived their entire lives in one village. They were expected to do so. When they were children, they lived in the village with their parents so they could take care of them. When they were adults, they lived in the village to take care of their parents. When they were old, they lived in the same village so their children could take care of them. It was the cycle of life, and they could not easily break it. They had a responsibility to their loved ones. How could James and John immediately leave their fathers to follow Jesus? Did Jesus give them the opportunity to say their goodbyes? I would think so. And I think that Peter, Andrew, James, and John must have had tearful goodbyes, being Mediterranean men. But yet, I bet they must have been excited about following Jesus as well. They must have been honored at being invited to go with him, but I'm sure it must have still been difficult to say their goodbyes. But you have to say goodbye in order to be able to say hello again. You must let go of the past to embrace the future. These men, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, were willing to do that. I find that amazing, but it cannot have been as easy as Matthew made it sound. Some people say goodbye to leave for college, medical school, or religious life, or for a new job opportunity, and sometimes they never return. Andrew, James, and John left their village to start a new life when Jesus called them to their new life. Jesus frequently asks us and calls us to a new life. That does not always require leaving old friends and families behind, but sometimes it does. Recovering addicts know what I am talking about. When they begin their recovery, they have to leave their old friends behind. Old friends that will tie them down to their old behaviors. It is well known that active addicts resent friends who quit their drugs or their alcohol. They will do everything possible, perhaps, to sabotage a friend's recovery. They will do everything possible to get a drink or a joint or a pill into their hands. Sometimes you have to say goodbye to be able to say hello. Sometimes you must let go of the past to embrace the future. When Christ calls us to become his disciples, he calls us to become new people. He calls us to allow the old person to die so that the new person can be born. Sometimes that requires a dramatic break with the past. Peter and Andrew, James and John had been fishermen. Jesus said, "Come after me and I will make you fishers of people." Actually, it's fishers of men. It sounds sexist by today's standards because it fails the inclusive language. It doesn't mention women, but it's a nice play on words that is easy to remember. You will no longer be fishermen, but you will become fishers of men. Peter, Andrew, James, and John had to leave behind their old profession so that they could carry on their new mission as Jesus' disciples. I had classmates in the Franciscans who were accountants, salesmen, social workers, teachers, and yes, even doctors. Those of us who were social workers and doctors still combined the old life with a new calling. Tertullian, one of the greatest early church fathers, related a story. One day, a man came to him with a problem. His problem was trying to earn a living in a heathen world. What if a mason were asked to build a heathen temple? What if a soldier had to say that Caesar is God? The man concluded by saying, I must live, no? Tertullian responded, must you? Martin Luther King had it right. In one of his last speeches, he said that longevity has its place, but longevity was not the goal. God had given him a dream. He had to pursue the dream. If that dream resulted in his early death, so be it, he said. Prophetic words. God doesn't call most of us to change professions. God doesn't call most of us to die for our faith. But God calls us to become new people and to live lives that are different as a result of having met Christ. Just as Jesus called Peter and Andrew, he calls us. Just as he called James and John, he calls us. Jesus has a special job for each of us, but a similar call to all of us. Come after me, he calls. How can we respond? I'm reminded of a story, a true story. Some years ago, a woman named Carolyn Yergin wrote about flying on a small airline in the Northwest. A flight attendant asked the man in the row ahead of hers if he would like dinner. He, semi-sarcastically, said, "What are my choices?" And the flight attendant responded, "Yes or no." Not later or maybe. Not after I take care of my business. Not when it's more convenient. Just yes or no. Our yeses and nos shape our lives. Your yeses and nos today determine what our lives will look like tomorrow. They will continue to affect us for the rest of our lives. Robert Frost understood that. He wrote a famous poem entitled, "The Road Not Taken." That dealt with decisions. He wrote, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry could not travel both. And be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." I want to be careful lest I give you the impression that if we make a mistake, we have no hope of recovering. The Christian faith emphasizes the opposite, that we can turn and start going in a new direction, that we can be forgiven. But it is also true that our lives will be easier if we don't have to today to unsnarl yesterday's mistakes. Christ calls each of us to be his disciple. He calls each of us to follow him faithfully each day. Answer yes, and he will give you a renewed sense of purpose. Answer yes, and he will make your life count. When Peter and Andrew answered yes, he made them fishers of men. When James and John answered yes, he gave them the power to change people's lives. When Jesus calls us, and he is calling us today, let us answer yes, and see how he can make something new, something wonderful out of our lives. And may the Lord give us all his peace today and every day.